All right, hey everybody. So this is another iteration of the PIBBSS Speaker Series. Today we have Steve Byrnes with a background in physics, but working on AGI safety these days. Very happy to have him. So yeah, I'm going to turn it over to you, Steve, and I guess I'll let you choose whether or not you want to have questions during the talk or you want to save them all towards the end, but I can moderate questions for you either way, whichever way you choose.
We'll take questions as we go, but obviously I might sometimes put them off.
Cool. So yeah, just raise your hand if you have a question and I'll acknowledge you, and then yeah, we'll turn it over to Steve.
All right, I'm going to share my slides. Please let me know if you don't see them.
I see them.
Great. Okay, so thank you for inviting me. I live in Boston. I'm a research fellow at Astera Institute at Berkeley, California, and we'll talk about challenges for safe and beneficial brain-like artificial general intelligence. This is based very closely on parts of a series of blog posts that you can find at that link on Alignment Forum. So let's just get started. So the big question that I consider myself working on is what happens when people figure out how to run brain-like algorithms on computer chips. So there's I claim that that's something that's plausibly going to happen sooner or later, so it's worth thinking about. And I find that people sort of split up into two camps when they start thinking about that question. There's the tool camp and there's the new species camp. So let's just take those one at a time. So on the first perspective, this is a popular one among AI people. They say, we're talking about AI. If you put brain-like algorithms on computer chips, then that is artificial intelligence. And AI is a tool that we use. You know, I have AI right now. I'm using GPT. I know what AI is, and AI is a tool for people to use. So if that's your perspective, then the subproblem that I'm mainly working on is accident prevention. And more specifically, the technical problem that I'm trying to solve is if people figure out how to run brain-like algorithms on computer chips, and they want those algorithms to be trying to do X, where X is solar cell research or being honest or being helpful or whatever you can think of, then what source code should they write? What training environments should they use, or whatever other adjustable parameters there are to make that happen? And this turns out to be a surprisingly tricky question for some pretty deep reasons that are mostly not going to be into the scope of this talk, but you can check the blog post series for more details on that. So here's sort of zooming out a bit to the bigger picture. If we want our awesome post-AGI future, then one thing we want to do is avoid catastrophic accidents where, you know, an AI kills everybody, and nobody wanted that. The people who programmed it didn't want it. The people who were running it didn't want it. Nobody wanted it, but it happened anyway. So if you want to avoid catastrophic accidents, then one thing you need is some procedure or instruction manual for programming a AGI that doesn't do that. And then you also need everybody to follow that manual. I'm mostly working on the red box, and I'm going to talk about it in this talk. I do very little work on the blue boxes, but that's not to say that they aren't important. Okay, so that was the first perspective. Brain-like algorithms on computer chips would be a tool, and we want to avoid accidents. So then the second perspective is popular among like biologists, among others, and they say, no. If we put brain-like algorithms on computer chips, then that's not a tool for people to use. It's a new intelligent species on our planet, and not just a new intelligent species, but one which will probably eventually vastly outnumber humans and think much faster than humans and be more insightful and creative and competent. They will, you know, make plans and then pivot if the plans fail. And if they have problems, then they'll solve the problems or figure out ways to route around the problems, and they'll invent tools to augment their capabilities, and they'll have communities and cooperation and all the things that humans and human organizations and human societies can do. if you put brain-like algorithms on computer chips, then those things would be able to do all those things as well. So if we are making this new intelligent species, as many AI researchers are trying to do, then how do we make sure that it's a species that we actually want to share the planet with? And how do we make sure that they want to share the planet with us? So whatever properties we want the species to have, we need to write the source code or find the training data or training environments or whatever it is to make it happen. So I think high functioning sociopaths are an important example here. They do in fact exist, which suggests that you can get the kind of new intelligent species that I'm talking about without any inherent intrinsic motivation to compassion and friendship and all those other nice things. And I would say that it's not only possible to do that, but it's strictly easier to do that. I think that if you want your brain-like algorithms to have compassion and friendship, you need to explicitly write that into the source code. You have to do extra work. And I claim that nobody knows exactly how to do that. So I think we should figure it out. So I'll get back to that in a little bit. So putting brain-like algorithms on computer chips is really just one path to AGI. What about other paths to AGI? So I claim that if our future artificial general intelligence is in the general category of model-based reinforcement learning, then my research in general and this talk in particular will probably be at least somewhat useful and applicable, otherwise maybe not. So I have a polite diplomatic cop-out claim, which is that we should be contingency planning for any plausible path to AGI or threat model if you're a doomer like me, on the theory that, well, so, model-based RL is a real thing, AlphaGo can do cool stuff. And, it's a major it's a major plausible path to AGI that people are really working on. And I claim that that's how brains work. So it can clearly get there. So this is like a good reason to work on it, even if we also believe that maybe AGI can happen by other methods, even if you think that AGI is more likely to happen by other methods. We should be contingency planning. What I actually believe, but won't argue for in this talk, is that we're very likely to wind up with this kind of model-based reinforcement learning or brain-like AGI, for better or worse. So that makes it especially important to be planning for it. So that was general motivation. And now we move on to a very big picture of brain algorithms as I see them. And in particular, these terms I made up: learning subsystem and steering subsystem. So let's start diving into brains. So my claim is that as even today, we already know enough about brain algorithms to say useful things about how a hypothetical brain-like AGI would work, and therefore what the alignment problem might look like in the context of a brain-like AGI. So a common objection I get to that is that the brain is just ridiculously, hopelessly complicated. And it kind of is. And, I make this joke myself, as you can see from this Twitter post. However, I think that brain complexity as it pertains to AGI is very easy to overstate. And the basic reason is that understanding the brain well enough to make brain-like AGI is different from, and in particular, much simpler than just understanding the brain full stop. And the latter is what, neuroscientists and cognitive scientists and so on sort of see as their job. But the former is mainly what I'm interested in, because I'm trying to anticipate what these future AI researchers are going to do so that we can prepare for it. So there's a few reasons that for the statement on the previous slide. The first is that learning algorithms can be much, much, much simpler than the trained models created by them. So for example, probably a lot of you know how to, type in the PyTorch code to train an image classifier. That's really pretty straightforward, gradient descent and so on. But if I ask you to scrutinize every aspect of the trained model that gets created with 100 million parameters, basically nobody knows how to do that. Like, it would be a giant research project that you would hire a team of Chris Olas for many decades, and maybe they could work it out. But it's clearly much, much harder. And by the same token, I claim that there are learning algorithms in the brain. I'll get back to exactly where they are later. If you're just interested in making similar learning algorithms in the context of an AI, then you don't need to know everything about the trained models that are built by within lifetime learning. But those models can be quite complicated. And if you look at cognitive scientists, they're often asking questions like, how does an adult human do task X? And that's really, at least in part, and I would say in large part, a trained model question and not a learning algorithm question. So that person is doing task X after a lifetime of experience living in the world and all of the learning associated with that. So people can build brain-like AGI without figuring out how all those trained models work. So the second reason is that algorithms are generally much simpler than their physical instantiations. So again, probably many of you in the audience, maybe all of you, can train an image classifier with PyTorch and basically understand all of the steps of how that works. But if I ask you, how does the chip work? Everything from ion implantation and, photolithography and, quantum tunneling, Schottky contacts and transistor physics and on and on and on. And then like up a level, the CUDA compilers and all that other stuff. That's like decades of work to understand all those things. So by the same token, I claim that the sort of core brain algorithms responsible for intelligence don't have to be that complicated, even if the way that they're implemented in biology is quite a bit more complicated than that. All of these protein cascades and everything else that you see when you zoom into a cell in the microscope. And then finally, not everything in the brain is required for brain-like AGI anyway. So for example, you can have quote unquote generally intelligent people, people who can live independently and carry on a conversation, hold down a job, all the things that AI can't do today. But if we could, then it would be the new intelligent species level of AI, even though they're lacking an entire cortical hemisphere or cerebellum or sense of smell, so on and so forth. So for example, in your medulla, you can find some brain circuitry that encodes how and when to vomit, like which muscles do you contract, what hormones do you release. And I claim that there's no way that people are going to reverse engineer that on the pathway to AGI. It doesn't matter for AGI, and it's totally useless from the perspective of an AI designer. Okay, so moving on, a key term or concept that I want to talk about is what I call learning from scratch. So I'm going to give two examples of learning from scratch, and then I'll say what they have in common. So the first example is any machine learning algorithm that's initialized from random weights. And the second example is a blank flash drive that I just bought from the store, where the bits are all initially random or they're all zeros or whatever. So what do these have in common? They initially can only emit signals that are random garbage or otherwise uninteresting, but over time they can emit more and more useful signals thanks to some sort of learning algorithm. So in the case of an ML algorithm, for example, as you're doing gradient descent, the initially random weights will create initially random outputs, but you do supervised learning or whatever it is, and the outputs become non-random and very useful. For the blank flash drive, you can only get useful information off of the flash drive after you've already written information onto the flash drive. So any kind of memory system is in this category. So my hypothesis is that a whopping 96% or so of the human brain by volume learns from scratch in that particular sense there. So that includes the whole cortical mantle, including the neocortex and hippocampus. I count the thalamus here too. The whole striatum, there's like an extended striatum that includes not only the putamen and caudate, but also the nucleus accumbens and parts of the amygdala. The whole cerebellum. The major exceptions I claim are the hypothalamus and brainstem. I think that those do not in any way learn from scratch. So should we believe that hypothesis? my take, obviously, I'm presenting it to you. I think it's true. I think there's a lot of strong evidence for it. And I go through that in my blog post, Learning from Scratch in the Brain. I find that a few neuroscientists would agree with that hypothesis, and a few would disagree. It seems that the vast majority have never considered it in the first place. For example, there's a somewhat famous article called Critique of Pure Learning, which talks about whether the human brain is a learning algorithm, or maybe it's a pre-trained learning algorithm, but it doesn't even mention the possibility that maybe the cortex is a pure learning algorithm and the brainstem just isn't learning at all. So anyway, on this theory, we can sort of divide the brain into two subsystems based on whether they're learning from scratch or not. And let's call them the learning subsystem and the steering subsystem. So the learning subsystem is built from scratch by within lifetime learning. And by the time you get, and the major component of it is some number of trained models, and they get horrifically complicated by adulthood. And the steering subsystem is more or less hard-coded by the genome, and it's the home of species-specific instincts. That's really, really central to how I think about the brain, and also to how I think about the alignment problem, as we'll see shortly. So I want to spend a few more slides clarifying what I mean by that. So this is some common misconception. So here are some things that my two subsystem picture is not. The first thing it is not is the distinction between old brain and new brain that like Jeff Hawkins talks about, or triune brain, which was popularized by Carl Sagan. So one thing is I draw the boundaries in a different place. For example, I think that the amygdala is obviously a within lifetime learning algorithm, and the hypothalamus is obviously not. But the triune brain theory tends to lump them together in a way that I don't think makes any sense. And also both subsystems are old, indeed extremely old, predating vertebrates. So if you look at the fruit fly brain, you can also find, I claim, a learning from scratch subsystem, namely the mushroom body. And you can find a steering subsystem, which is not mainly doing learning, like the lateral horn. And there's sort of embryological, there's like gene evidence that those are sort of descended from the same two subsystems as in humans. So of course, in the last 600 million years, our learning subsystem has gotten a whole lot more complicated, and so has our steering subsystem. But anyway, they're both old. Another thing that this is not is a blank slate or nurture over nature theory. So for one thing, we have this whole part of the brain, the steering subsystem, which is just chock full of very specific instincts that are different between species, and a lot of nature is coming from that. Also, learning algorithms have internal structure. Obviously, if you want to run a learning algorithm, you don't just open a blank Python interpreter and press go. You have to have neural architecture and hyperparameters and learning rules and inference algorithms and all that other stuff. And then last but not least, learning is not the same as a human is deliberately teaching me. Obviously, if you have, for example, a reinforcement learning algorithm that learns to control your own body from an internal, so for example, your brainstem can have a signal that says I am or am not standing up, and then you can do reinforcement learning to move your writhe around until you're standing up, and that's legitimate within lifetime learning, but it's not the kind of learning that you would say is nurture. That doesn't really depend on anyone else but yourself and your own body. And then the third thing that my two subsystem picture is not is plasticity versus non-plasticity. So if you have a within lifetime learning algorithm, it absolutely has to have plasticity because you have to store all this information. However, if you have the steering subsystem can have plasticity too, because just because it's not a learning algorithm doesn't mean that it doesn't have any persistent variables that are occasionally updated. So if you have any algorithm that you want to put in the brain, let's say your evolution, and you're trying to put some algorithm in the brainstem, and you want it to have like a counter variable, for example, that counts the number of times that the rat has won a fight in its life. The way you would do that is with a plasticity mechanism. So I wouldn't call that a learning algorithm, but it is definitely plasticity. And then the final thing that this is not is some brilliant idea that's unknown in machine learning. So for example, AlphaZero, you can look at the GitHub, you'll find, well, it doesn't have a GitHub, but if it had, wherever the source code repository is stored on DeepMind servers, you can find some subroutine that sees whether or not it's checkmate. And that would be the kind of thing that I claim you can find in the steering subsystem, like the brainstem. It's just so obvious in machine learning what's doing what. Like the learning algorithm is labeled learning algorithm, and the reward function is labeled reward function, and you don't really have to think too hard about it. Whereas in the brain, it's not so obvious what's what, and it's more important to talk about these things explicitly, I think. Okay, so moving on to the final part of the talk, I claim that the steering subsystem, basically the hypothalamus and brainstem, is the ultimate source of motivations, drives, values, and so on, and that this has important implications for AGI safety. So let's start by talking about model-based reinforcement learning, which I mentioned at the beginning. So I claim that, at least from a safety perspective, we should really be thinking of the brain as doing a version of model-based reinforcement learning, in the sense that there's a model, like I can make predictions. If I go to the store, then I can buy a cookie. Or maybe the store is out of cookies, so then, I shouldn't do that. The model is updated by self-supervised learning. If I'm watching a ball and I don't think that it's a bouncy ball, but then it bounces, then the next time I see it falling towards the ground, I expect it to bounce. And there's reinforcement learning. So if I touch a hot stove, then I'm not going to do it again. And I will consciously think of touching a hot stove as being a bad thing to do, other things equal. So model-based reinforcement learning is a very big tent. You can probably download 500 archive papers that all describe themselves as model-based reinforcement learning, and they will all be different from each other. And importantly, they will all be different from the brain as well. So I want to make it clear that I am not taking model-based RL to be a description of a particular class of machine learning algorithms that you can find on archive. Instead, it's just sort of a generic term for any reinforcement learning algorithm that involves a model, as in the previous slide. So the details of how reinforcement learning model-based RL works in the brain and how that differs from what's on archive won't really matter for this talk. You can see the blog post series for some of the more details on that. So I use the term steering subsystem. Why did I make up that term? Because one particularly important task it does is to steer the learning subsystem to emit ecologically useful outputs by sending it rewards. So you touch a hot stove, and then the steering subsystem sends negative reward. So you're less likely to do it again. And you consciously think of it as bad, as I mentioned. And this is kind of analogous to how a reinforcement learning reward function steers AlphaZero to do certain things. So if you give AlphaZero reward for getting checkmate, then AlphaZero is going to start emitting more and more moves that lead to checkmate. If you reward AlphaZero for, doing really badly in chess, then it's going to do that instead. So sooner or later, I claim, if people make these kinds of model-based RL algorithms that are brain-like, they're going to get to a place where they need to type in some code for their, virtual AI steering subsystem. And what are they going to put in that empty box? So here's 3 categories of things that they could put in. The first category is things that the steering subsystem just needs to do from a capabilities perspective in order to get general intelligence. And I think a cardinal example of that is the curiosity drive. There's abundant evidence from machine learning that curiosity improves the performance of RL models, and humans are curious too, and animals are curious too. Presumably, this is important for capabilities, and therefore we should expect AIs to also have, future AI programmers to also put those things into their AIs. And I wrote that that's unfortunate because, we don't want our future powerful AGIs to have to be pursuing their own curiosity at the expense of caring about human welfare, for example. A second category is everything else that's in the human steering subsystem. And an important example here is social instincts, the things that make us care about each other and nice to our friends and mean to our enemies, and we care about status and all these other things. So these are usually present in competent humans, although there are exceptions like high functioning sociopaths, people with other conditions. Well, I do think that high functioning sociopaths have some social instincts. I just think that they have very different social instincts from other people. And yet they can still, solve problems and invent things and so on and so forth. So do we expect these to be in future AGIs? My answer is not by default, but it's possible if we figure out exactly how they work and if we convince developers to put them in. And then last but not least, every other possibility, any code you can type, you can put into a steering subsystem, just like you can put it into, relatedly, reinforcement learning reward function. So there could be an innate drive to invent a better solar cell, assuming you had a way to implement that. Humans do not have that. It's nowhere to be found anywhere in biology. It would be a new thing to this world. And by default, I do expect that developers are just going to mess around with, different kinds of reward functions. So how do these work in humans? More specifically, how does the human or animal steering subsystem know when to provide reward? I think that this is $1 million question. And the reason it's tricky is that the hypothalamus and brainstem are kind of stupid. They don't understand the world. They don't understand what's going on. And yet we're trusting them to provide ground truth on, whether all of my thoughts and actions are, pointing in a biologically useful direction or not. So how do these work? One part of the answer is that the steering subsystem has its own often ignored sensory processing systems. This was actually in the diagram before, you might have missed it. I put a little star next to it. So the inputs like vision and interoception go not only into the learning algorithms, but they also go directly into the hypothalamus and brainstem. So for example, vision goes to the visual cortex, but it also goes to the superior colliculus in the brainstem. Taste goes to the gustatory cortex in the insula, but also to the medulla. Smell, I believe, goes to the hypothalamus via mitral cells. So anyway, this is one part of the answer. For example, so the superior colliculus is, I claim, not a learning algorithm. It is a basically hardwired visual processing system. And I claim that it has a hardwired face detector and a hardwired snake detector, and it's involved in, fear of heights and all these other sort of instincts that are related to the visual world. I claim the literature is kind of bad on this, but I can go into why I believe that. But that's only one part of the answer. So for example, your brain cannot calculate when to feel envious just by looking at simple heuristics on raw sensory inputs. So how does the steering subsystem build social instincts in particular? I think it involves empathetic simulation somehow. I mostly don't have a detailed answer. I'm working on it. You can see post number 13 for some vague speculations. So this is actually most of what I've been doing, spending my research time on for the past year or so. Why do I want to reverse engineer human social instincts in the hypothalamus and brainstem? I have two answers. The modest answer is for better understanding of the AI alignment problem. So basically, I think we need a science that can reach conclusions of the form, innate drives X plus training environment Y leads to an adult AGI that, explicitly wants and desires Z. And if we understand human social instincts, then we would get examples that could ground that yet to be invented future science. A bold answer is that maybe we can just get specific ideas to steal for AIs. So the sort of dumb version of that is that we can slavishly copy human social instincts into an AGI. I don't like that answer. I think that for one thing, AGIs will have very different training environments from human children in numerous ways. So you can't assume that the same instincts are the same sort of innate drives are going to lead to the same adult desires. And also human social instincts leave something to be desired. I don't want our future AGIs to have teenage angst and bloodlust and all those other delightful things. A better answer is that if we understand how human social instincts work, then maybe we can adapt some of them to work for AGIs, presumably in conjunction with other non-biologically inspired ingredients like interpretability. So thus concludes my talk. I think that people are sooner or later going to run brain-like algorithms on computer chips. I think it's a very big deal. The best or worst thing that will have ever happened in human history. I think there's technical work that we can do today to increase the odds that things go well. And thank you for listening.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. That was really great. I have questions of my own, but I want to pause and see if anyone in the audience has questions. If you'd just like to raise your hand. So I'm not seeing anybody. So yeah, so one question I have is, you sort of talked about like other sort of dual systems that you're not discussing. Well, I'm going to pause. Somebody raised their hand. I want to give them a chance to ask their question first.
Okay, hello.
Hello.
Okay, hi. So you said you maybe don't know this, but I'm curious if you have any like guesses about what it might look like to steer curiosity about really complex things. Like if I'm curious about quantum mechanics or something, what might that look like if the subcortex is doing it or steering it?
Let's see. So the machine learning literature has a bunch of versions of curiosity, I think. And I haven't read any of those in detail. But that might be a place to start. So for example, if you make a video game agent that is curious, and people have done this, like that can sort of refer to sort of complicated, it can be curious in a sort of complicated and abstract way about its environment in a way that you don't have to specify in detail in advance. But I'm not sure how those work and whether those are working in the same way that human brains are working. That would be maybe the first place I would start, but I don't have any better answer than that.
What could I ask a follow-up first?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. But like, maybe you don't know, but in the curiosity literature, like, does the curious part end up having a model of the complex thing? Or is it like it's somehow model free, is able to steer curiosity?
I sort of imagine something about like looking so you can have like, I wouldn't have said it as something like that. I would have said something like maybe the curiosity module, maybe like your world model is sort of spitting information about sort of status information about like how confused am I, how inconsistent are my observations, and you know, maybe I'm not sure exactly how that's operationalized, but if the cortex is able, so the cortex has this world model in my view, and it's, if the cortex was able to somehow dump information about whether its observations are consistent with its world model or whether it keeps getting surprised and confused and, you know, its predictions keep getting falsified, then you could have something like positive valence if you're keep getting surprised and confused by what you see or do, or something like that. I mean, as soon as I started thinking about this, I realized that the thing I said doesn't work in detail because it would have weird edge cases where it breaks down. But I don't know, something like that. Maybe.
Okay. Cool. Thank you.
Did you have another question?
Yeah. Hi.
Hi.
Yeah, I was curious about why do you expect model-based RL to be maybe the most likely paradigm for AGI? And like something that I'd like to clarify is like, is this different from like a scale, like sort of like scaled up version of current deep learning plus some reinforcement learning? And if so, like, why do you think there is, or why do you think, or like, what do you think are the gaps in current like machine learning systems that motivate you to work on this other paradigm?
Let's see. So deep learning is a big tent. Like mu0 is deep learning and GPT-4 is also deep learning, but mu0 and GPT-4 are really quite different from each other in almost every other way. So you know, if you time travel back, you know, before even 6 months ago, certainly more than a couple of years ago, it was a pretty popular opinion to say that things like mu0 are like clearly the path to AGI. And then large language models started doing really great. So then people kind of forgot that it existed at all. I think that let's see. I do think that GPT-4 and model-based RL are sufficiently different that I usually don't get very much out of reading, you know, alignment of GPT-4 type blog posts. And I imagine that the alignment of GPT-4 people don't get very much out of reading my blog posts either. I mean, there's more than zero overlap. I do read the blog posts. Sometimes I get something out of them, but they're mostly different. So you're not asking about that. You're asking about the capabilities question. Let's see. So
yeah, I'm sort of curious of like, what's your model of like what the first AGI looks like in the model-based RL, in your model-based RL paradigm?
Let's see. I'm not sure what you mean by what it looks like. So for example,
for example, some people have in mind, well, we will like train a large neural network on a wide range of tasks, a bit like, you know, maybe it looks something like a large transformer that is like trained on like various tasks that are encoded in text or something like that. You know, that could be like one like rough model of like, and on top of that, you had some reinforcement learning from human feedback. Like that could be like one kind of rough model of like what's like first AGIs looks like. And like I'm like curious if you have like some sort of like, yeah, picture like that of like what first AGI look like that like you think pose a threat and that your like model, that your safety program address. Yeah. That motivates your safety program basically. Yeah. If you don't, maybe you don't, it's okay. It's just, I'm just, yeah, curious. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the thing you said would not be the threat model that I'm interested in.
Mm-hmm.
That's a sort of large language model.
Yeah.
Let's see. Yeah, I mean the human brain is obviously a very concrete thing that we can look at, and we have some information about how it behaves. That's like more than enough information to be like, in my opinion, very concrete about you know, what sort of things might happen and what are failure modes and so on. So the way the model-based reinforcement learning works in the brain is kind of a long story that I don't know, you can get more details in the blog post. So the further that model-based, the further that AI gets from how the brain works, the more likely it is that the stuff I'm talking about won't be relevant to it. I am guessing that anything that is, generally described as model-based RL, including even things like mu0 that are non-brain-like in many important ways, would be close enough that they would get something out of my blog posts and writings. Yeah, I would say that the human brain is a good model of the threat that I'm interested in.
Thanks.
Yeah, go ahead, Jason.
Yeah, thanks. I was wondering, you had this this kind of simple equation of the drive times the environment leading to certain behavioral outcomes. And I was basically wondering what your thoughts are about the possibility that maybe we will have a really hard time understanding the environment in which such a future superintelligence will evolve, maybe because the environment will change very drastically, very quickly. And so that even if we figure out a lot about the brain, we might actually not be on a path to a safe system.
I do tend to be pretty what's the word, despondent that we will never get to the point where we can say innate drives X plus training environment Y equals an adult AGI that wants Z. I am deeply concerned that it's just this very long and windy and contingent path through what thoughts is the AI thinking in what order and what random things is it encountering when. I think that's, human superstitions are sort of like a frightening example of how humans can wind up wanting things that are basically completely random and a priori unpredictable just because they happen to coincide with good things happening. I join you in being concerned that this research program is impossible. I still think that we should be trying to do it, and if we are trying to do it, it would be good to have the human example of if we understand the human innate drives, then it would also be useful in sort of understanding how impossible it is, because we can look at whether we can sort of compare what the innate drives are saying with what the range of human adults are. There are examples where identical twins raised apart will wind up with surprisingly unified, object level beliefs about religion and other things. And I don't know. Yeah, I'm not really disagreeing with you there.
Yeah, thanks.
Are there any other questions? I see the hand is still up from the group in Prague. Do you guys have any more questions?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go for
it. Just again on the curiosity thread. So I guess I'm not really sure how to phrase it. I think I'm a little bit if you're getting all of your reward from the subcortex, it feels like there's an incentive to wirehead basically. And why doesn't the neocortex, if curiosity is something tracking positive valence on surprisal, why doesn't the neocortex either A, go to really surprising environments all the time, or B, I don't know, cause itself to be more confused about things so that it's getting the reward signal?
Let's see. So in terms of wireheading, wireheading is a pretty complicated procedure for humans. You have to go, presumably, find some shady doctor to implant a wire. So presumably you will wirehead because you think it's a good idea to wirehead, because you plan to wirehead. So then the real question is not is the wireheading rewarding, but rather when you think the thought, maybe I'm going to find a shady doctor to implant a wire in my skull, is that thought rewarding? Like, is that a thought that your brainstem detects to be a, genetic fitness enhancing thought? And the answer depends on how it matches up with previous thoughts that you've had, and so on and so forth. So for example, if I actually smoked lots of cigarettes, then I would get addicted to them, and I would think it's a good idea to smoke more cigarettes. But that fact is irrelevant to the decision of whether to smoke cigarettes in the first place. Instead, I decide whether or not to buy my first cigarettes based on, how a pattern matches to other things that I like or dislike in the world. And as it turns out, I don't want to smoke cigarettes. So that's sort of one of the notes that you touched. In terms of curiosity and maximizing surprise, yeah, I think that I don't have a great theory of curiosity, but if you had one, then you would want to know why people aren't motivated to look at a string of random numbers forever and keep getting surprised by them. I suspect that there would be some answer like on the meta level, like you sort of learn so you can learn a model that doesn't issue very low level predictions. Like you can learn that something is unpredictable and then you just ignore it. Like if you're zoned out, then nothing is a surprise because you're not predicting anything about your sensory inputs in the first place. I would also say that not everything about your models are constrained by reward maximization. I think that your world model gets mainly updated by self-supervised learning, and that's not the kind of thing that's straightforward to undermine by the reward mechanism. So it's like a constraint. Like it would be rewarding for me to believe that I'm swimming in the Bahamas right now because that's a nice thing for me to do, but I can't just make myself believe that. I am constrained by having models that issue correct sensory predictions. And that constraint is arising from a different subsystem that is not trained by reinforcement learning, but rather by predictive learning, I think. So if you look at different parts of the brain, I would say that there's parts of the brain where the plasticity rule, the update rule, is really just coming from, predictive loss, and other places where predictive loss is involved, but so is reward learning. In particular, famously, there's like no basal ganglia loops coming from primary visual cortex, presumably because primary visual cortex is not trying to maximize reward, it's trying to process sensory inputs. And it would be crazy to allow to sort of tell primary visual cortex that its job is to maximize reward when you just want it to be an honest reporter of what it sees. I have a blog post about this called "Reward is Not Enough" from a couple of years ago.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Also, a quick comment on that question. It seems to me that a lot of art, music, literature, philosophy of the 20th century is seemingly trying to maximize surprisal for surprisal's sake. I feel like that's a big trend in the past century of the arts.
Yeah, that seems fair. If you just want to be, yeah, surprise definitely comes along with, physiological arousal and other things that can be, pleasant for people. So then you get these sort of cultural drifts. I was just thinking about that in the context of, I was writing a blog post on laughter that had a section on humor. And yeah, if part of humor is getting surprised, then that just means that humor is just going to randomly drift from decade to decade in like whatever weird ways, and they'll be splitting between humor subcultures who have different shared assumptions and then get surprised by different things. It's fun.
Are there any other questions?
Not from here currently.
I had two quick questions, or I think one is quick. I think we'll see. So when you were talking about the other sort of two system theories that you're not talking about, one that I don't think you mentioned is like the dual process theory, where just like roughly speaking, generally one system's kind of automatic, fast, affective, and the other system is slow, involves conscious reasoning or something like that. I mean, there's lots of different variations of dual process theories, and it seems to me that on one hand, if you just like present the two-sentence version of your two systems, you might say, oh, the learning system's automatic and fast, and the steering system is slow and involves conscious reasoning. But I think when you dig into the details, it sounds like both are really sort of automatic and fast. And so I was just sort of wondering where like a dual process model might fit in on your view, particularly from the perspective of alignment. Because when I think of like slow conscious reasoning, I'm thinking of how we might add logic-based programs to on top of deep learning RL systems for some sort of alignment purposes, keeping them in check, something like that. So yeah, I was just wondering what your thoughts are on that in general. And then the second question was just real quick. Have you thought at all about reverse engineering like social insects for alignment purposes?
Let's see. Okay, so taking those one at a time. So for the first one, I basically, let's see, I'm going to copy this blog post into the chat by Kai Satala. Its title is System 2 as Working Memory Augmented System 1. I basically endorse, I guess I haven't read it in a while. Last I recall, I endorse every aspect of that blog post, and therefore don't think that there's an important distinction between, or I don't think that the distinction between System 1 and System 2 is like at the level of like brain algorithms kind of thing. Or certainly not like different parts of the brain are doing System 1 versus System 2. So you can read that for more detailed argument on those lines. For social, is that okay? Can I move on to the social insects question? Okay. And then for social insects, I have not looked into them, and I'm not planning to. It strikes me that I wouldn't learn anything that's useful for the questions that I have from social insects. I think that I'm already concerned that I'm not going to learn anything useful from mice, who are already a good deal closer to humans. So like there's easy ways to have social instincts. Like one easy way is like, if you're a mouse and you smell another mouse, and this can be hardwired because presumably to some extent all mice smell the same. So if you're a mouse and you smell another mouse, then that's a social situation. And if so, do X, Y, Z. So that's like a social instinct that one can imagine mice having. And that's like interesting, but it's not that interesting. And I don't think that it's helpful for like humans have like status drive and sort of moral ideas and Schadenfreude and all this stuff, which I think somehow seems to be based on some sort of more abstract and empathetic understanding of other humans. And I'm not sure that you can get answers to those questions from the sort of simpler things like, if I'm a mouse and I smell another mouse, then do X, Y, Z. So I think social instincts are like a step in the wrong direction, and I'm having a hard enough time just with rodents.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, that was sort of what I anticipated, especially on the first one, how you would respond. I just wanted to clarify. But yeah, thank you. Let me give anyone else a chance to ask any other questions they might have before we conclude. All right. Well, yeah, thanks for joining us, Steve. That was really great, really interesting.
Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah. And we'll see you all at the next speaker event.